Okay, welcome to the Writer's Block, a short YouTube series where we discuss writing tips and techniques for Fordham University students or just writers in general. And today, Peter and I are going to be talking about citations. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of like exactly how to cite. We're going to save that for another video. But we want to talk about why we cite and when we would cite. So, Peter, what would you say is one of the reasons why we cite?
Good question. So if I'm thinking about an academic paper, why I want to cite sources, I know that one reason is that it's the moral good practice to do, right? Other people have done hard academic work. They've written papers just like I'm sitting there writing a paper, and I want to give them credit for that work, of course. And then a second reason would just be that it bolsters your credibility, right? Like I don't know everything about organic chemistry or Russian history.
Mm-hmm.
And so I need to cite other people, right? I need to bring in other voices there to make my argument valid.
Yeah, the credibility is the huge part about that, in my opinion. It's showing the reader that you've done the work, that they can follow up on what you've done, and they'll maybe come to the same conclusions. So that's definitely a great point. Also, giving credit where credit is due. I would say the third big one is that it equips the reader to be able to enter the conversation with you, and it can kind of turn you into another source. It's sort of like giving someone everything they need to continue a conversation with you. So you're not just like coming in heavy-handed saying this is how it is. You're like saying, look, I've looked at these things, I've worked from here, and these are the conclusions that I've drawn. And so it really prepares a reader to then later on come back and say, well, they think this, but I think this.
I think what you're alluding to there is this notion of the they say I say structure that we often talk about in papers. And if you're writing a personal essay or a journal entry, um, the I say, right, what you have to say may be all you need. But if you're writing something beyond that, right, like what I have to say about Russian history isn't super important because I'm not an expert. So we need those experts to have the they say.
Mm-hmm. So that would be, I'd say, the three big reasons as to why we cite. Then we've got three main cases as to when we cite. The first one, pretty much everyone knows this, is when you're taking someone else's language directly. You put it in quotes, you put the page number or the source at the end. And this is sort of the most common way that we see citation done in student essays. It's something that we like train students to do a little bit. And it's good. It's a useful tool, but it's one of those things that you always want to save for when the original author is saying something better than you could say it yourself. Oftentimes, we'll have people who just put down citations without trying to use the citation. And whenever you're doing that, you want to make sure that you're weighing in on it to some point. Blah 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 argues this here, and then include the citation, or add something specific from you to whatever is going on there. We have this thing that we call a dropped quote, where you just plop down a quotation in the middle of your writing without giving any context for it or weighing in on it whatsoever. And, a lot of people think that the relevance of it will be obvious, but that's because they're so close to their own writing that they don't necessarily see how a reader's going to see it and just come across a random quote from someone else.
Yeah, and I think this idea, Kyle, of a random quote is sometimes problematic. What I do when I'm reading, whatever jumps out to me, like whatever's funny, whatever's striking, like whatever just feels really quotable, right? Like, oh, that's a great way that they put that. That has panache. That has, that's really powerful. That's what you want to quote because probably they're saying it better than you, and then you get to harness that power for your essay.
Absolutely. I call that the underline rule, where I won't quote something unless I've underlined it in my notes.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah.
Um, so the second case where we quote is when we're doing summary of someone else's argument, of someone else's research, things like that. And oftentimes this is the kind of quotation mark that quotations that get left off of papers, because you may not be using any language directly from the papers or the books that you're reading. And this is when you're dealing with like specialized knowledge, stuff that you didn't know before, but you needed to learn to be able to make your argument, and you need the reader to understand your own argument. So anytime you're kind of compressing a book down to a paragraph, or telling us what happened in some sort of survey or historical period, if it's not well known, if it's not common knowledge, then we probably need some sort of citation on it. We might not need quotes, but we do need a citation, a reference, so that we can go and check that out ourselves later if we want to.
Yeah, good points.
And then the last time that we absolutely always need to quote is when we're directly borrowing a data set or information or a graph or a chart from someone. Same for images, things like that. This happens a lot more in like statistics, or it happens in sort of scientific papers, cultural survey papers, things that will have you looking at other people's research. And rather than just taking it for fact or taking it as granted that you have access to these things, you do need to quote and like make sure that you're giving the credit where credit is due, and showing a trail of accountability for where this all came from.
And this does play out in the humanities as well, as you said, with images. You know, if you're using someone's photograph, someone's drawing, someone's poem, right? All of that needs to be cited and quoted from just as much as an intense research paper might.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we deal with as graduate students is getting the rights to use images in our presentations or in our own dissertations and pieces. And oftentimes we'll have to put like a little note somewhere in our writing, image courtesy of blank, whatever museum or archive we're working from. So I figured we'd take a look at 5 sets of sentences, just go over how quotes are being used in them, how citations being used in them. So here we go. So this first 3 sets of sentences are from student responses to my papers. Now I've edited them, and we went over the paper prompt for this a little while ago, a couple episodes back, when we went over how to understand a professor's paper prompt. So let me just read out sentence set number 1 here, and we'll get you to weigh in on this. In Norse mythology, Odin is a noble god of wisdom, war, and death. He makes several grave sacrifices, including his right eye, in order to obtain the wisdom required to save the dwellers in Asgard.
All right, so if I'm looking at this first sentence here, I think it's going to depend on context and the setting in which you're writing and presenting this paper. And so I see that it makes some claims that you might have had to look up, right? Who is Odin? And where, say, what do we know about Asgard, right? Those are 2 claims that are built into this sentence. And so if this is a sentence in an informal paper for a class about Norse mythology, perhaps it wouldn't be necessary to cite because it's general knowledge. But if you know that your reader is going to be encountering this information for the first time, help them out, cite it.
Absolutely. 100%. That's what we did. This is a class where we've discussed Norse mythology and in depth. This is very basic knowledge for these students. And so for the general audience that they're writing for, the audience doesn't need to have this cited for them. They know, they understand, it's common ground. And so this idea, when we say, is it within common knowledge, that common knowledge can kind of be adjusted by the audience that you're writing for. So you and I, when we're writing about post-colonial theory or something highfalutin literary stuff, we don't have to cite the very basics of it because it's understood that the audience that we're writing for knows where it's coming from.
Yeah, well put.
Let's try sentence 2. In American Gods, Neil Gaiman explores the idea that gods need worshippers and accomplishes this by showing how far certain gods will go to win worshippers and thus gain power.
So when I'm looking at this sentence, the second sentence, I see the word explores. And so explores the idea, and then what follows is sort of general information. And so I'm going to assume that Gaiman makes this point throughout American Gods. And so there might not be one particular paragraph or page that I would cite. To me, this feels more like general information that doesn't require a citation.
Yeah, there isn't one specific place that's being pointed to. It's kind of pointing to the novel itself. And so we've got this phrase in American Gods, which is doing that pointing anyway. So we really don't need any sort of citation otherwise.
This is definitely a sentence that I could imagine might be followed by a more specific sentence that would probably contain a citation.
Well, let's look at example 3, because that's exactly what we've got there. On the contrary, the old gods begin to fade and have to find a new means of survival, as evidenced by Mr. Wednesday, Odin, in the novel Telling Shadow. Our true believers passed on or stopped believing, and we were we were left lost and scared and dispossessed to get by on what little smidgens of worship or belief we could find. Then we've got Gaiman, 123, period.
So this sentence seems very different than the previous two. This is a specific passage from Gaiman's book, right, which the author of this paper didn't write, and so it's quite necessary to quote from Gaiman himself.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I love about this sentence is that it puts the evidence after the argument. We've got like the statement about the old gods starting to fade, and then it's giving us this supporting evidence. Oftentimes we'll get people who throw in the quote and then think that afterwards they give us, their analysis of it. When really what we're reading a paper for is your argument and then evidence to back up your argument and then to tell us why it matters. So there's sort of like a natural progression. You don't want to start with the evidence and then tell us why it matters. All right. So these next two are some of yours. Do you know where they came from? I assume so.
Sure. So these are again from an undergraduate's paper, sort of a cursory look at Edward Said's Orientalism. And so I'll read sentence 4, and then maybe you can weigh in.
Great.
Throughout Orientalism, Edward Said shows how key parts of Western culture, from Shakespeare's plays to Delacroix's paintings, depict the Orient as mysterious, exotic, and even barbaric.
All right. This is very similar to sentence number 2, where we've got this throughout Orientalism. So I can't really point to one specific place. It's more the general argument. So no citation needed. We're already sort of including the entirety of the text. We've also got that, depicts the Orient as mysterious, exotic, and even barbaric. I can assume that those are separate places within the text that are going to then maybe later on be more specifically mentioned in the argument.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that. And there's a lot in this sentence, which means that it's probably not necessary to cite it. In this book, there's probably a whole chapter on Shakespeare. There's another chapter on Delacroix, and then probably pages and pages are spent unpacking mysterious, exotic, and barbaric. And so even if you were to try to find one page that would capture all the information in the sentence, it probably doesn't exist, and so not necessary to cite it.
All right.
Number 5, to bring us to an end. In Orientalism, Edward Said analyzes Wolfgang Mozart's 1791 opera, The Magic Flute, as an intensely Orientalist work of art that depicts the East as a docile entity that exists to serve the West.
Okay.
Page 118.
So this is, well, first of all, I'd like to check out the citation here, because we know that it's citing Orientalism. Either it's the only book that's being cited here, or it's referring back to the In Orientalism. So I like the fact that we just have 118. We don't have Said 118. But because we're being so specific about the magic flute and what the depiction is doing, absolutely we need a citation. So that if I wanted to make sure that this is correct, if I want to double check that Cite is actually saying this, I can go directly to that page. So for sure, citation needed here.
Yep, that makes sense. And Yeah, again, it's just moving from the general to the specific. Here we're looking at a specific author, a specific work of art made in a specific year, and so it's far more likely that you can find that page that captures that in Said's book.
All right. Well, I think that is enough for today, and I hope that anyone out there watching, listening, can kind of understand that there's a little bit of thought that goes into when and how we cite. There are some absolute surefire rules. If you're borrowing language directly, if you're borrowing a chart, data, images, stuff like that, absolutely got to cite. But then when we're doing summary, when we have like this general knowledge idea, there's a little bit more leeway as to the kind of audience that you're writing for. All right. Well, that's it for us today. And I hope you're all staying awesome out there.
Stay awesome. Thanks to you.